I think the biggest challenge was reminding ourselves that everything that we knew this far from our time of making wine in Australia, it was good training, and of course it was part of our craft and who we are, but let's not do things exactly the same way.
Hallo Freunde, herzlich willkommen zu einer neuen Folge des Winzer Talks. Heute mal wieder eine Folge auf Englisch. Ich gebe euch nur kurz eine deutsche Einführung, damit ihr wisst, um was es geht. Und zwar bin ich gerade im China Club in Berlin und ich treffe mich mit Stephanie Dutton. Das ist die Winemakerin von Penfolds aus Australien, und sie ist den ganzen Weg von Australien hierher gekommen nach Deutschland, um jetzt hier im Podcast mit mir verschiedenste Weine zu probieren aus einer Kollektion, 2 Hemisphären und 3 Kontinenten. Wir werden genau darauf eingehen, was die Unterschiede sind zwischen den einzelnen Weinen und wo der gemeinsame Nenner liegt, weil das interessiert mich vor allem. Was sind die Beweggründe, was ist die Motivation dahinter, wirklich den australischen Kontinent zu verlassen und nach Frankreich zu gehen, nach Kalifornien, um dort eben auch Penfolds Weine zu erzeugen von einem anderen Terroir, aber mit der Handschrift und mit der Stilistik von Penfolds. Und das gilt es eben herauszufinden, was ist diese Handschrift von Penfolds, was ist dieser gemeinsame Nenner. Und wie kann man das alles quasi in diesen Weinen erfahren mit Grange, mit diesen unfassbar spektakulären Weinen, wo sich die Winzer aus aller Welt wirklich danach lechzen, um diese Weine zu probieren in einem Tasting. Das ist wirklich was ganz Besonderes. Und dementsprechend will ich jetzt gar nicht mehr so viel vorwegnehmen, sondern direkt in das Interview hüpfen. Herzlich willkommen zum Winzer Talk. Ich bin Daniel Bayer und das ist der Podcast zur Website wein-verstehen.de. Ich sag hello, Stephanie. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been too long since I've been in Berlin, but great to have a chat.
Did you get anything from my introduction?
Every now and then there was an expression. I could tell roughly what you were talking about. You were talking about style. You were talking about winemaking. You were talking about different parts of the world. I got the gist.
When you talk about wine, it's multilingual, like all the languages together. When we speak from our heart, everybody gets it. And thank you so much for being here. And first of all, I want to ask you, who are you?
It's a good question, and most mornings I have to work that out myself. But my name is Steph Dutton, and I am Penfolds' senior winemaker. I am part of a winemaking team that now operates across multiple countries, 2 hemispheres, but also responsible for making wines for a brand that is nearly 180 years old. My day-to-day jobs and tasks are never consistent, and I have to say that being able to work in a team of 8 winemakers in total means that between the group we pick up coverage where we can.
Wow. So you don't even look like senior?
Maybe, hopefully senior by name, but not by nature.
So you are like really on the peak of your career right now, I assume. This is such a big deal. But for me, it's very interesting to take a look at the past. Like, how did you get passionate about wine and how did you end up at Penfolds?
It's a really good question, because I have to say Penfolds as a brand seems to have this knack or this way of, once people join the team, there's a grip that really occurs for a very long time. We have long apprenticeships and long tenures in the team. Some of my colleagues have been with Penfolds for decades, 30 plus years for several team members. And the grip for the wine industry for me really came from working in hospitality. And like any university student, my undergraduate was in science, or genetics to be more specific. And I was working in restaurants, some of the greatest restaurants in Melbourne. And as you can imagine, you're opening up spectacular wines from around the world, every single day. And for me, that was far more interesting than what I was studying at university. And so I made the decision that at the end of my course, I would study enology. And that had me moving from Melbourne to Adelaide, which has a world-renowned course when it comes to tertiary qualifications for winemaking. And it was when I moved to Adelaide that I sought out Penfolds, a winery that was just up the road. And I always intended to stay just for the duration of my course. But here I am 15, 16 years later, and Penfolds still has enough to keep me interested and engaged.
Wow. This is so interesting. Wow. As you discovered this passion for wines and you opened up all these fancy wines all over the world, was there one kind of wine or stylistic you were really into it?
The answer is yes. And a couple of years ago, there was a group of winemaking colleagues and myself, and we were all getting together for a tasting. And the theme of the tasting was that you must bring along the wine that changed your life. And as you can imagine, there were some bottles that maybe only cost 10 or 20 euro, and there were some bottles that were costing a fortune in this lineup. And for me, I brought along a bottle of Barolo because it was a bottle of Barolo when I was working in an Italian restaurant in Melbourne, and I opened it up for a table. I opened it up for customers, and it was like nothing I have ever tasted before. And it was the wine that made me stop and say, you know what, maybe this hobby could be a career path as well. So there was one moment, I do remember that single wine, and it did change the course of my life, and it had me embarking on a completely different direction.
What was it in this wine that really catched your attention?
I think first and foremost, it was the fact that I was serving it to a table of 8 guests. And every single one of them, we all have different tastes. We all have different preferences. And it was the fact that every single one of them were really, blown away by the quality. But then for myself, I think it was this ability to see a wine that was so intense in terms of flavour, but you could still describe it as being elegant and ethereal. And there was a lovely lightness that came to it. Even though it was powerful. And ever since then, I think I've really tried to strive, to make wines that have intensity, plenty of palate weight. They should have presence or charisma, but at the same time, there should be an elegance, a silkiness about how they present.
Sounds like a beautiful balance.
Yes.
Wow. So, and then you ended up in Penfolds 16 years ago.
Yeah.
And how was your start there? Did you enter Penfolds and you were already completely engaged and it was all super easy for you and it was just your path and it's all there and you were just wow, it's just meant to be? Or was it sometimes even a challenge or a struggle for you?
In the early days, I never thought that this would be more than a journey that would be 1 year, probably 2. We all have a story like that, don't we? Where we think that the next step is going to be temporary or transient. And I was studying, and my course as a postgraduate was 18 months. And I thought I would stay with Penfolds for 18 months whilst I was studying and getting my master's degree. And then I'd head home. I'd go back to Melbourne. It's where I'm from. It's where my family and friends were. And when I was studying, I was working in the restaurant at Penfolds McGill Estate. So not so far from Adelaide, the city, 10-minute drive, we have our spiritual home, the heartland of Penfolds in South Australia. And there is a world-class restaurant that exists there. And each night, after being at university during the day, I was opening up wines that were 10 years old, 20 years old, sometimes 30 or even 40 years old. And I think being exposed to that many wines with that much age on them, it gave me a great understanding of house style and what Penfolds stood for. I slowly realised, a little bit like people, you start to fall in love, and that connection is really strong. And so the 18-month project, became something that was coming to an end. And I remember at the time, the senior winemaker, so my predecessor, came up to me in the restaurant and said, you're just about to be qualified. You're just about to receive your master's. Would you like to come and do a winemaking vintage with us for the next season? And I didn't have to think twice. The answer was yes. And then one season led to another season, and we're 16 years down the track.
Wow. And you just followed your excitement, your passion?
Yeah, I did. I had a question only in the last couple of days where somebody said to me, have you ever been tempted to start your own business or your own label? And the answer is yes, but probably only at the very, very beginning. And that was before I realised that at Penfolds, you never know everything. You are constantly learning, and we are a very well-known brand, particularly around Australia, but now around the globe. And we operate at, a sizable scale. And with that scale and with that quality comes so many learnings and so many opportunities and so much that continues to keep you interested and curious and constantly learning. And so that desire to do anything on my own, it really just sort of, it went away because there's so much at Penfolds that keeps me on.
Yeah. I mean, especially when you leave Australia and you go to different continents or countries, you just get so many new perspectives, even though it's wine, but it's all through a different perspective. So you get so many questions, so many challenges, and it's never ending, right? Exactly.
And, when I first began at Penfolds, one vintage a year seemed like a big enough task. It seemed like, for 3 or 4 months of the year, you were going at a faster pace with a heavier workload. It's the time of year where all the excitement of the fruit coming in, the ferments on the go, you see what quality emerges. And then, where Penfolds is now, all of these years later, we now have 2 hemispheres and multiple vintages. And there's always something that keeps you learning, whether it's making wine in California, making wine in Bordeaux, making wine in Australia, it's impossible to know it all.
I completely agree. I mean, from my perspective, I'm here in Germany, which is a complete other bubble, other clients, other people, other approach to wine. I mean, everywhere people are different. And they just have a different expectation about what a wine should be like. Like if I live in California, I expect a complete different experience of wine in my glass compared to I'm a guy from Germany or Austria or something like that.
And I think it would have been really easy for us as Penfolds winemakers to make wine exactly the same all around the world. But where's the interest in that? For us, we had to realise that we know so much about our craft back home in South Australia. But when you're operating in California or whether you're operating in Bordeaux, you have to be open-minded enough to be sensitive to the region that you're in, but at the same time still true to the core values of what Penfolds stands for and what we're known for and what we're famous for.
Let's dive into this. I'm really excited. Okay, what are the core values of Penfolds?
I think first and foremost, Penfolds has always been associated with excellence, quality. And one of the things that is very much alive and well in the culture at the Penfolds winemaking team is always wanting to do better, never wanting to stand still. And we have always wanted to make sure that the next generation of winemakers, of consumers, of viticulturalists are in a better position than the previous generation. And to be able to do that, you need to make sure that you're offering them more knowledge, I think higher quality as the years go on, but also being smart in the way that you use your resources as winemakers. We rely on the land. We rely on what Mother Nature gives us, and we operate in smaller regional communities. And so I think for me, associated with the quality and striving for excellence is also doing it in a way that is really beneficial for the regional community that you are in. Australia is a large country by geography, but a small country by population. I think I keep getting reminded that if you were to overlay Australia on top of Europe, Australia is bigger in terms of land mass, but about 26 million people. And so the wine industry is really quite substantial for Australia, and we export. We have a lot of bottles that leave our shores, a lot of bottles that stay on Australian shores as well. And so making sure that when you're operating at that global scale, you're doing things in a way that feels right.
So is it easy to keep your core values all over the world, or there's some countries where you say it's not possible there?
It's non-negotiable. We have to keep our core values intact. And I think what makes it possible or a little bit easier for us is that I mentioned before we're a winemaking team of 8. And if you look at those team members, they have decades of experience with Penfolds. I'll call out Andrew Baldwin, 38 vintages with Penfolds. Kim Schroeter, who looks after our white wines, and Kim is 37 vintages with Penfolds. Our chief winemaker, Peter Gago, 34, I think he's coming up for with Penfolds. When you have that consistency in the team, it helps keep things consistent the world over, and I think that's important. When it comes to understanding house style, when it comes to understanding what the Penfolds personality is in the bottle, if you haven't had that long-term team work or tenure that exists in the team, I think it would be a lot harder.
Steph, we already talked a lot right now, like 15 minutes, and I feel like my mouth gets a little bit dry. So in order to explain the different styles of wines, the hemispheres and everything, we just prepared some wines today. So we are going to taste 3 different wines right now. One wine is from the United States, one from France, and one from Australia. And we are starting with this wine from the United States. And yeah, I would like to ask you to tell us something about these wines and what's the idea about it.
Of course, I love the selection that you've gone for. First of all, you've gone straight to the top of our family tree, and each of these 3 wines has really quite, a unique story in their own right. Bin 149 is sourced almost entirely, but not quite, from Napa Valley fruit in California. But underneath on the bottle, which I'm looking at right now, there's a little line that says Wine of the World. And this, for Penfolds, certainly, but for really, I think many in the wine industry, was quite a new statement or classification, if you like, to see on the label. And I have to take you back really to 2018 when we were in California for the very first release of our wines, the very first vintage that we did. And we were in new territory, on new ground, and we were finding our feet in another country after many, many years of trial work and groundwork and experiments. And what we did is we actually had with us a couple of bottles of the best of our best from Australia with us, almost as benchmarks, or reference points. And we were blending in the tasting room, as we do. That's what our day job is most of the time. And we were referring to these benchmarks. And we just asked ourselves the question, what would a couple of drops of this Australian wine at the highest level do to the Napa Valley blend that we had just put together? And we loved what it did. In terms of a couple of drops, it shifted the dial immensely on the wine style. It bolstered the character that was already there. And it gave this lovely Penfolds-esque lens to what we were doing. And so we had to work out, was this an experiment that we wanted to get the knowledge of just for us, or did we want to share it with our collectors and our loyalists? And so what we decided to do is we'd actually blend Australian wine in with the Napa Valley majority component for this blend, and we would write Wine of the World on the label. And I say to people, it's a little bit like people. You can tell a well-travelled person from one that is not. You can tell a knowledgeable person and a wise person from one that is not. And for me, this wine is worldly in what it has to offer in the bottle. It's a different dimension. It's another way of looking at fine wine and seeing that when the best of the best comes together across different countries, what does it end up looking like?
Wow, I love this story. And I'm really curious now to taste this wine. So let's...
Cheers.
Cheers. Wow. What I really love about your wines, even though they are really, really young, they're already there.
We love to see an approachability to wines that can still go for decades in the cellar. And quite often it's quite easy to make a wine that is beautiful in its youth. It can be a little bit harder, but still possible to make a wine that is age-worthy in the cellar. But being able to do both is quite a challenge. And we look for a wine that has glossiness on release. We look for a wine that has energy and vibrancy. But at the same time, our hopes, and I do believe that we have achieved it, our hopes for this wine is that it will be pulled out of cellars in 10, 20, maybe even 25 plus years' time.
So what I also really like is, you already mentioned it, like this vibrance in the wine, the energy, like this kind of sensation which keeps you drinking, this mouth-watering effect. And for us Germans, it's really easy to have this sensation because we are a cool climate and we have a lot of acidity in our wines, like Riesling, for example. We have to make it even a little bit sweeter to keep that balance. But if I think, or as we as a collective from Germany, like if you tune into Australia or Napa Valley, we just think about really hot weather, like where you have to struggle to do not get too much levels of sugar and that you can have at least a little bit of acidity. So how do you do is to keep this energy and this vibrance in the wines?
It's a good question because you're right, it is a challenge and our climates are very, very different as we move around from parts of Australia to California to, of course, various regions in Bordeaux. And then you've compared it against, of course, some German examples where cooler climate, high acid. I think for us, the answer lies in the art of blending. And the whole concept of blending is that you have many parcels of different character. You want diversity. You want them all to look different because there's not much fun in blending if you're blending things that all look the same. And so when we're trying to put our blends together, we're often looking for a wine that has a backbone that is bright in acid, and we look for a wine that can bring an aromatic lift to the glass. But at the same time, you're overlaying that with a parcel that maybe has some richness and density to fill out the palate. And if you're doing your job correctly as a winemaker, you should be able to bring into a blend all of the best elements of a wine through different parcels. And that art of blending is something that's hard to learn. it's incredibly intuitive as a winemaker. You either have a feel for that blending game or you don't. Mm-hmm. And I think that being able to make something that has that brightness about it comes from making sure you're picking something at the right time with the right chemistry that then ends up making its way into the final blend.
Mm-hmm. And this process of blending is so hard and difficult. I really tried it sometimes when I was at a few wineries, and I always thought, okay, this cannot be like difficult, you just put this and put there and blah, blah, blah. And then you just realize, okay, wow, it actually doesn't taste at all what I did. Like, what's the secret? Is it something you can get over experience, or is it something you have like in your guts? Like, is it a feeling in your stomach and you know exactly what you do? It's just going through you, or is it something that comes from your mind?
What I can say is it's really hard to learn the art of blending via textbooks, or it's not something that's taught at university. And for me, it's something that is far less academic and far more with your gut, as you said. And when you're working in a team of 8, as I mentioned before, it creates a lot of discussion when you're putting a blend together. And I think a lot of the time as a team, we are constantly reviewing each other's work and making sure that we can't be 1% better or just 0.5% better in the name of excellence. But every single one of my colleagues, I think, has that intuition and that gut feel for how to make Penfolds blends and Penfolds wines come to life and create something that is really quite complete. So I think it's hard to teach, but you can learn from your colleagues. Mm-hmm. I think it's almost impossible to learn via textbook alone.
Yeah, and this makes the difference. Like, then you're really excellent, and then it's when the magic happens, when you create really like wines that are different.
I often think about it in the same way you see artists in other industries. And, whether you're thinking about the interior design industry, whether you're thinking about the fashion industry, whether you're thinking about architecture or the design of automobiles, there's always a creative director who I think leads with their gut. Mm-hmm. And it's no different when it comes to wine as well. There's a personality that ends up in the glass of what we're just drinking now. And that personality is shaped and influenced by its creator. And I think that, particularly in the fine wine scene, in the luxury space, is what collectors want a piece of. And it's really hard to quantify. But if you're doing your job correctly as a creative director in any industry, you're creating something that's pleasing to people.
Love it. All right. So we still have the Cabernet Sauvignon Bin 149 in our glass. Mm-hmm. And just dive into that a little bit more again. Like, what was the biggest challenge for you to produce wine there in Napa Valley?
I think the biggest challenge was reminding ourselves that everything that we knew this far from our time of making wine in Australia, it was good training. And, of course, it was part of our craft and who we are. But let's not do things exactly the same way. Because if we did things exactly the same way, I think you'd end up with something in the glass that was a little soulless. I think you'd end up with something that resembled the Australian wines, and in which case, what was your reason for being then? And so for me, it was being open-minded enough to listen to colleagues in another hemisphere, listen to the knowledge that they had to share, and backing your gut still, but allowing yourself to operate in a different way. And I look at the regions amongst Napa Valley that we were looking at for vineyards. We were in Oakville for some of this fruit. We were in, Howell Mountain up in the mountainside. And I kept wanting to compare those vineyards or those regions to what I was used to back home. But it's best not to compare. because it's not meant to have winners and losers. You're meant to create wines that end up looking diverse.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I would love to go there. I've never been to Napa Valley.
Well, hopefully we can tick that off the list sometime soon, and we can share some of these vineyards because they are quite special in the place that they come from.
Yeah, and the climate, it's not even too warm, right? You have always this spot where you have a nice breeze or where it's a little bit cooler.
Absolutely. I mean, Napa Valley is quite close to San Francisco. And of course, San Francisco is famous for its fog that rolls in across the bay. And what that means is the fog will often invert, the temperature that you see in a region nearby, like Napa Valley. You have beautiful, warm, generous climate during the day, but you have quite cool nights in Napa. And I think that we call it that diurnal temperature fluctuation, the difference between night and day, really is very important to the quality that starts to come through in the region. That's why you get it.
Mm-hmm. And this is 100% Cabernet?
It is 100% Cabernet with a small percentage from Australia, which is Cabernet too, and the majority, of course, coming from Napa Valley.
Mm. Oh, super interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Are you ready for the next wine?
I am. We're still in the same hemisphere, but we've hopped to another country now with the next wine. The next wine being a collaboration between both Penfolds and the Doch wine group in France. So let's have a look now for this one. So this one here is called Two, and it signifies the two hemispheres and the two brands.
And it's the second wine.
Together. And it's the second wine in our lineup as well.
What a synchronicity. I love it.
It is. And there's a really important call out with this wine here. When you look at Bin 149, this is a Penfolds project, a new project, but it is Penfolds from the start to the end and everything in between. And we say with Bin 149 and with the Californian portfolio, it was Californian soil, Californian sunshine, but with everything Penfolds in between. When we hop to this second wine here now, the collaboration with Doch, this is a true collaboration. This is two brands, two producers, two creative beings putting their minds or palates, in this case, together to create a joint project. And I remind people that in the wine industry, this intra-industry collaboration of multiple brands or two brands coming together, it's not unique, but it's rare. It doesn't happen often. Whereas again, if you look at other industries outside of the wine industry, take the fashion industry, for example, brands are always collaborating together. And I think collaboration is such a beautiful way to be brave as a brand. It's a beautiful way to experiment, and it's a lovely way to make progress in a faster way than doing it all on your own all the time.
Wow. So what was the biggest challenge here, to collaborate with someone?
I think the biggest challenge is making sure that the wine, what actually goes in the bottle, comes together harmoniously, because we were lucky at this collaboration. Our minds between the Doch group and Penfolds were aligned. We worked with each other very, very well. However, it's making sure that the wine that you're crafting is going to fit together like a puzzle piece with each other. And making sure that comes together harmoniously is probably the most important thing, but also the biggest challenge.
Sorry for asking you already, what are the biggest challenges? What is difficult?
No, not a problem.
I mean, when you think about Penfolds, it's already beautiful and it's excellent and everything. But the interesting thing is always how you get there. What do you have to face and how do you solve it?
It's a good thing to bring up, because the challenges are, of course, always going to be a part of these projects along the way. And every time we get a new wine or a new release into bottle, and we launch it and we share it with our collectors, with our followers, with our consumers around the globe. Sometimes it can look like it's just a flick of the switch and the wine appears and it's launched with a lot of fanfare. But it's also really good to talk about the trial work, the experiments that go into making these new releases. You know, particularly in the case of the Californian wine, 25 years worth of a journey, of a story before that wine came to being. Years and years of collaboration and groundwork in France before we ever had something to put together in the bottle. And of course, in the best possible way, experiments that don't work out. We all have them. And instead of being failures, they are simply a new trial number. Trial number 1, trial number 2, trial number 3.
I love this mindset. It keeps you in a high vibration.
It does.
This is how it works.
It does. Nothing comes easily.
Yeah, exactly. So we are in France right now. What I'm really curious about it is what did you excite about France? Why are you so ambitious about to produce a wine there?
I mentioned at the very beginning of this podcast that we have always been quite obsessed with excellence and quality. And of course, we see that in Australia in so many of the regions that we operate in the Barossa Valley, in Coonawarra, in McLaren Vale. But also there are wine regions all around the world that excel in what they're doing. And of course, France has been perhaps one of the most famous countries when it comes to wine production. The history, the longevity, the knowledge, the following that France and its various wine regions, whether it's Bordeaux, Burgundy, Rhone, they have around the world. And I think when you're looking for the best of the best, regardless of what country you might be in, I think it always was going to be logical that France was a part of that story. And if you look back into our history books, we are a brand that I mentioned before, we're nearly 180 years old. We're 1 year off that milestone or that birthday. And over the 180 years, we have had wines that have looked very different over time. But perhaps most importantly, in the 1950s, or 1950 to be exact, our very first chief winemaker, Max Schubert, actually ventured over to Europe on a study trip and stopped off in Bordeaux on his return to Australia. And it was in Bordeaux that he saw these great wines of the world capable of cellaring for 30 or 40 years in exceptional vintages. And he wanted to bring that knowledge back to Australia. And it ultimately influenced not just how Penfolds made wine, but how the Australian wine industry made wine. And so I think having that link and knowing what influenced us in the first place, being able to return to that country and collaborate with them is really quite amazing. And you end up with a wine that's entirely unique and age-worthy.
I totally agree. Absolutely. Just take another sip. Is it also pure Cabernet Sauvignon, or is there something else?
As is the case, most of the time with Penfolds, you've always got a little bit of a blend going on. So I'm going to pull forward the bottle here. And if you have a look on the left-hand side, there's the representation of the two hemispheres or the two brands. And you have for the Doch group, you're in France, as you mentioned before, and you have Cabernet Sauvignon. You turn the bottle around, and on the other side, you have Penfolds in representation. And Penfolds, one of the things that we are most famous for is, of course, our Shiraz. And so you have South Australian Shiraz from the 2019 vintage coming together with Cabernet from France, also from the 2019 vintage, giving us a blend not only of countries or regions, but varieties too.
So how is the percentage of Cabernet and...
It's funny, so many people really get, they want to know the numbers behind the wine. It's human nature to always want the information. And for winemakers, we do all of the blends without even knowing the numbers sometimes. And so it's only once we turn, the page over that we realise what we've got. The South Australian Shiraz is the minority portion, sitting at around about 30%. And the French Cabernet from Bordeaux is sitting at around about 70%. So they're not coming together in equal proportions, but they're coming together in the proportions that we thought looked best on the bench in front of us.
Wow. So what would you say, which style and which character brings the Shiraz into the wine?
I think Shiraz is always known for its generosity on the palate. It can be quite mouth-coating. It has a lot of breadth across the palate, and it has lovely fruit sweetness and fruit power and fruit purity. Whereas when you look at the Cabernet, you see a wine that is quite tight and racy. We call it linear across the palate. And I think if you're able to bring in something that has the line and the length together with something that has the breadth and the expansion, you create something that is hopefully complete from start, middle to end.
Yes, it's completely balanced. Like it's more elegant and lighter in the style than the previous wine.
It is.
And for me, like it would be really interesting to age this wine. Like, where does it go, like in 10, 20 years, when all the complex aromas come into this wine and makes it even more exciting?
You're right. And I've got some ideas about where this wine is probably heading over the years and in time, but I also don't have all the answers. And I think when it comes to wine, it can give you a lot of information in the glass when it's in front of you. However, like you just mentioned, there is still so much information that is yet to be revealed. And wine is one of those amazing, I guess, drinks or items where not only can you enjoy it today, but this could be, a family heirloom. It can be a bottle that is something that is passed down to the next generation. It's something that you can share with the next generation, maybe in 20 or 30 years' time. But I do also remind people, I'd far prefer to drink a wine too young than to drink a wine that's too old. So if you're ever in doubt or you don't have the cellaring conditions at home, it's okay to leave some of it a mystery and not know where it's heading and just drink it today.
Okay, Steph, I really appreciate this wine. And before we go to the next wine, I really want you to ask, what's the main difference between the two wines we had so far in the class, like countryside?
Yeah, it's a great question because we are so familiar with Australian geography, and even us ourselves, we're getting to know the geography of these other countries that we are now with our boots on the ground in. And for me, when I'm in Napa Valley, to paint a picture of what it looks like visually, is you have two really large mountain ranges on either side of the valley, as the name suggests. And down on the valley floor, you have a lot of the fruit for this wine here. I called out Oakville as a little bit of a sub-region before. But then you look up to your left and you look up to your right, and you've got these two mountain ranges that are on either side of you, that are really quite foreboding. They have a big presence. You do travel up into the mountains and, of course, see vineyards as well. But I think that terrain, that unevenness is something that's really quite a feature of Napa Valley. Then you head to Bordeaux and the landscape looks very different again. The way that the vines are set up, we talk about the architecture of the vine. We talk about also a little bit more of less of the mountainous regions and the slopes more so in the vineyards rather than the big steep, almost scary looking mountains that are on the other side of you in Napa Valley in California. The way that you grow the vines can also be quite different. Some of the vines, in Napa Valley, they might have a bit of a sprawl in terms of their canopy or splitting the canopy sort of left and right. Whereas then you end up in France and everything is quite structured. The fruit is positioned all in a zone down the bottom, and you've got the canopy that you really lift up to make sure that you expose the fruit to get that sunlight penetration. So you're right. things look different in these countries. It's not just about the feel and what's in the glass, but these regions have different history attached to them too. You know, Bordeaux has been around for so long, making wine, of course, it's what it's famous for. And this region has influenced so many other regions around the world in what they do. And I think that that's really important to acknowledge, is that we all learn off each other and we take inspiration off each other.
Yeah, I love this. So now I have really a picture in my mind. This is really beautiful.
It is. We'll have to get you there, particularly to Napa Valley.
I'm totally in. So, okay, and now we go back to your home, like where you come to Germany, where all your journey started.
We've spoken a lot today about new and innovation and experiments, but it's also really nice to talk about a wine that is very much about tradition. And the very first vintage of Penfolds Grange was in 1951. It was a trial year, but, you know, that's now a wine or a story that is over 70 years in age. And I think back to what the Australian wine industry looked like at that point in time. Most of what was being produced in our country was fortified wines, you know, so I'm talking about the ports, the sherry production. There was a lot of brandy production in Australia. And dry table wines, they existed, but they weren't particularly common. And then Max Schubert, as I mentioned before, our chief winemaker at the time, came back from a study trip in Europe and he wanted to try something completely different. And so this little wine called Grange, which at the time was quite a brave venture and quite a departure from what we were doing in the industry, really did change everything for Penfolds and for the Australian wine industry. And I think Grange almost gave birth to a family of wines, you know, in the way it led the charge. It came first, but it influenced this whole family of wines that we now refer to today in our current portfolio. Bin 389, Bin 28, Bin 407, Bin 707. They are all related to Grange, but at the same time, their personalities are very, very different.
All right.
I think, the other thing that's worth mentioning with Grange is in the early days, it was very misunderstood because it was so unfamiliar. It wasn't necessarily popular straight away. And, as with all things that are brave and that take conviction to stand by, it takes, a team or an individual, Max Schubert in the case of Grange, to really stand firm in his beliefs. And it wasn't until years later, maybe even a decade later, that these early vintages of Grange had begun to soften in the bottle and their age-worthy potential was really starting to show through. The tannins were a little bit more gentle. The fruit was sort of softening a little bit on the palate and in the glass. And as a result, you ended up with a wine that was so complex and so elegant compared to, I guess, the big, bold thing that it started as.
Wow. So how many years did this take, until you realized this?
I think in the early days, it probably took more than a decade of production before our collectors, before the media, before the industry started to acknowledge that this wine called Grange was really quite incredible as its personality and as its character changed over time. If the first vintage was in 1951, it probably wasn't until the early 60s that people started to see the wine's worth.
Is there a meaning for Grange? Does it mean something?
It's a good question. The original Penfolds brand was founded by the Penfolds family, and the Penfolds family had come over from the UK. They had ventured over to Australia. They had settled in the new colony of Adelaide back in 1844. And the family consisted of Dr. Christopher Rawson Penfold, Mary Penfold, and their daughter Georgina Penfold, who was just 1 year old at the time. And when they arrived in Adelaide, they built their family home, which is now known as the Grange Cottage. And the Grange Cottage was named so after Mary Penfold's family home back in Scotland originally. So Grange was a reference to the family home where they lived in the new place that they now called home in South Australia.
I love it.
Shall we pour?
Yeah, let's pour it.
Okay. Do you want me to do this one? You're good.
I try.
Perfect.
Yes.
That worked well.
You're getting there. After a few glasses of wine, I get more confident about pouring.
Like an expert.
Yes. All right. Vintage 2018 is in the glass.
I have to say, as soon as I lift this up to my nose, you get this air of comfort and familiarity about the wine, with more than 70 consecutive vintages. It's no surprise that you get to learn the style very well.
Wow. This is so good in the nose, even though it's so young. It's just, you don't want to put your nose away from the glass anymore.
I've had a couple of people say to me recently, we talk so much about the ageability of Grange, and we talk so much about the fact that it can last decades and be handed down. And they come to me and they almost feel embarrassed or ashamed because they say, oh, but I like it now. And they think, that's right, and they think that they're going to offend me. Or it upsets me, but I remind them, do you know what? Just because it can last for 40 years doesn't mean that it shouldn't be enjoyable today. Mm-hmm. And if drinking young wine is your preferred style, then that's how you should drink wine.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why it's already so good is because it's already so vibrant. It's already has this mouth-watering effect and this energy, and it's already. Even though you don't have like this ripe notes right now, you still have like spicy notes. You have the herbs and with this beautiful juicy fruit in it. It's just super yummy.
I honestly think that some of that is due to the vintage of the wine as well. 2018 was an incredible year. And, as I look out the window now, I'm reminded that, all of this is at the mercy of Mother Nature. We've got a beautiful clear day here, but just as quickly the skies can open up and you have rain, or you have hail, or you have prolonged wind. And all of these things affect the growing season of the vintage. And in 2018, I think the conditions were so consistent and reliable. And I never use the word perfect in wine because I wonder if perfect is ever possible. But it was as close to perfect as you probably will ever get. And we had lovely warm days, but they weren't extreme. We had lovely dry weather, but it wasn't drought. And I think as a result, we often say that the 2018 vintage, it's not the biggest of anything, but it's the best of everything. Mm. And that to me is, you spoke about the vibrancy and you spoke about the perfume and you spoke about how, I guess, pretty the wine was in the glass. I think that comes back not only to Grange, but to 2018.
Yeah, now we have all the three wines in the glass. And now it's interesting to compare the styles of the wines. So just curious, probably the Grange is your favorite?
For me, it's the wine that we've had 70 years of practice on. And the fact that it's from such a strong vintage, the 2018 is my favourite today. And like everybody, we change our minds on different days and we're in different moods on different days. And so the 2018 Grange may not be my favourite every day, but for today, it is. How about yours? Do you have a favourite today?
I mean, I'm just blown away by the Grange. It's another level. Like it's on top of the top of the top. And if I look at the other two wines, like the France wine, I really appreciate the style of the wine. Like especially for an Australian winery or Bordeaux, where it's always about like, I don't want to say it's you or something like that, but you expect more bold wines. You expect power and like it's there. But this wine is so well balanced and elegant and vibrant at the same time. It has all the spiciness and the nice fruity aromas, but in a different way. So I really appreciate this. And the Cabernet Sauvignon, I really like the spiciness in there. It's so, this roasty aromas, it's so delicate. And if I consider myself like sitting in Germany on a winter day, like the oven is on, you have a nice fire and you just sit there and enjoy because it's so cold outside and you sit there with your blanket. It's the wine for this. Yeah. It heats you up from inside. It gives you a nice feeling. And I appreciate all the wines, but of course, if you tell me now, Daniel, you can take one bottle with you at home, I would take the Grange probably.
Yeah, I can understand that. And you're right, you've just gone through, 3 different wines for 3 different occasions as well, 3 different moods that you might be feeling. And I think Bin 149 for me is all about the texture. And the texture has this power and lightness all together in one for me. I think there's a lovely savoury edge in the Bordeaux, or the Doch collaboration with Penfolds. But for Grange, we call it saturation. It's got beautiful density. It's got beautiful power. It's got probably the most structural tannins out of the 3. But maybe for me as well, having, worked on the wine through that vintage, I also know how perfect that year was in terms of the conditions that we received. And so we have that emotional attachment to the wine also. This is a wine we've now changed the dominant variety to be Shiraz. So we've been on a wine that is Cabernet. We then went to a blend, and now we're looking at a wine that is 97% Shiraz with only a tiny 3% Cabernet Sauvignon blended in with it. And I think for me, Grange smells and tastes like home.
What would it be like to produce 79% of Shiraz in California instead of the Cabernet?
It's a good question, and I think they're the sorts of things that we're going to want to trial with. But at the moment, the highest quality material that we can get our hands on in California is still Cabernet. In Australia, I think some of the highest quality material that we have is Shiraz, and recognising that the 2 regions they have different strengths is important. But we'll continue to work with Syrah or Shiraz in all of the regions that we have our boots on the ground in, because, of course, it's the backbone of what Penfolds and the Australian wine industry is famous for.
Yes. So now we have 1 hour already on the clock and we tasted all the wines. So we come slowly to an end.
Sure.
I would really love to know, from your perspective, what is the biggest challenge for the wine industry we have to face for the next decade?
It's a really good question, because for the next decade, one of the things that we always live in fear of, I think, is natural disasters that come and affect the wine industry and wine production. A couple of years ago we had bushfires in Australia, and now there are parts of the world that, we're looking at floods. And these extremes in temperature, obviously, they affect the consistency of what the wine industry needs to be putting into a bottle. And I think over the next 10 years, what we have to be good at is adapting to regions where maybe the same variety that's always been planted there isn't necessarily the right variety for the future. Maybe the regions that we've been operating in, we need to add to the list and look at regions that are further south or higher in altitude. And so I think that open-mindedness, that ability to be flexible and change, because it's hard to do that quickly in the wine industry. There's a lot of groundwork that goes into new plantings or setting up infrastructure and equipment in other regions. I think that's something that we're going to have to get our head around. But the good thing about the Australian or about the global wine industry, it's a really tight-knit community. And I think that there's a lot of collaboration that will help us all get to where we need to go.
Thank you for the bold answer. Love it.
Thank you.
So I need to talk about this because it's so interesting. Like, obviously, you're a woman and you're in such a high position right now where you expect, like, in the wine industry, there are mostly men. Like, the whole wine industry there are so many men, and it's like also this energy, like, from the man. And for me, it's so interesting. Like, the picture I have of you, you're still in your female energy. Like, you have this aura around you, like you have it all under control, you hold the place, you got it, but it's more like this nature energy, and it's not like something that comes from I have to be like this masculine thing, it has to be this, blah. So you are more like in this female energy, and you allow things to happen, and you trust that it's gonna be right because you know.
Look, I have to say, there are two really big benefits that I would like to call out of having both genders represented in the wine industry in the most equal way you could possibly imagine. And the first is, I've mentioned a couple of times that we are a winemaking team. And in a team, you function on another level in such a different way and with great balance when both genders are represented. And one of the things when I first started at Penfolds, which was now, 15 years ago, I was the only female team member coming into the team. Not the first, but the only one at that point in time. And I remember my male colleagues saying to me, the team has just changed, but for the better. They noticed that we talk differently, we communicate differently, we work differently. And they were really appreciative of a different way of looking at things, or a different energy, as you said, or aura that had come into the team. The other big win of having, equality in the wine industry and both male and female representation in the craft is that wine drinkers are both men and women. Males and females both drink wine. And so if your consumer, if your collector is both male and female, then it makes sense that the creators are both male and female. And we've spoken about such diversity in what ends up in the glass. To get diversity in the glass, I think you need to have diversity in your team. But I certainly don't have it all figured out. I don't think many people do. And you do trust the process and just know that each time you're turning up at work, you hope that you're making a difference in the team and for the industry, as I said before, for the next generation to be in a better place than where you are now.
Yeah, I really love what you say. And for me, it gives such a nice quality to Penfolds to give you this trust as a female to bring the whole company like on a new level.
I think both my colleagues and the brand, the business as a whole, has always backed that approach and always supported the winemaking team in achieving equality and balance.
So the last question, then we can go to the lunch.
Go for it.
Which is going to be amazing, by the way, the lunch.
I think so too.
I'm so excited. Like, we are going to taste, I think, 6 wines.
Yes.
And for me, I'm vegan, vegetarian. We are going to eat meatless.
Perfect. I love that.
Me too. And maybe are probably thinking right now, how can this be? Like, you are in Australia, you have Shiraz, like you need a bloody steak, you need meat. What's your opinion about that?
The best way to approach food and wine matching is firstly start with food that you enjoy and wine that you enjoy. That is the first match. When you go down to the level of the detail, keep in mind the old rule of red wine with red meat and white wine with fish or white meat. It's so outdated now because what you need to do is match the flavour and the strongest component in the glass to the flavour and the strongest component on your plate. Not the colour of the meat, not the colour of the plate, of what food is on there, but instead the flavours of the food that is on the plate. And for me, that's the art of food and wine pairing.
Mm-hmm. So, and just for me as a curiosity, I would love to ask you, what's your favourite food combination, like really local, like from Australia with your wines? What's that?
We have a beautiful fish that is local to South Australia called whiting, and whiting is incredibly subtle. Whiting is incredibly delicate in its flavour, and there is a white wine that we produce called Yattarna Chardonnay, and Yattarna Chardonnay with our local whiting is heaven for me.
Oh my goodness. So now I'm really hungry and looking forward to have this wonderful lunch with you.
Fantastic.
My deep gratitude to you for showing up in Germany to have this amazing conversation with me, show me your wines. And what's the plan for you now in the next days?
The next 48 hours are in Berlin, and then I hop over to Bordeaux before heading back to my family and Australia on Tuesday evening. So time away is always enjoyable, but getting back to family is really quite special too.
That's super special.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Schön, dass du dabei warst. Wenn dir dieser Podcast gefallen hat, dann bewerte mich auf iTunes. Wenn du Fragen hast oder mehr Informationen zum Thema Wein suchst, dann schau auf meiner Website wein-verstehen.de vorbei. Bis zum nächsten Mal.